The Wyoming wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at the bones of Thaddeus Riley's failing ranch. For 12 years since he'd buried his wife Sarah and their unborn child, the wind had been his only constant companion. It had carved the grief right into his face. He split another log, the sharp crack a lonely sound in a valley of ghosts. But then another sound. Wheels on the dirt path. A gleaming black carriage rolled into view, a vulture in the gray morning. A woman stepped down. Margaret Whitmore, his dead wife's sister. Her face was a mask of cold satisfaction, and in her gloved hand, she clutched a leather portfolio like a knife. Thaddeus knew that look. It was the look of the end. "You're losing this place, Thaddeus," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. No greeting, no sympathy, just the cold, hard fact. The bank is calling in your loans. You are 3 months behind. He'd known this day was coming. The ranch was bleeding out, a slow death he couldn't stop. Without Sarah to manage the books, the letters, the numbers, it had all turned to dust in his hands. Margaret's smile was thin and cruel. "But I have a solution." He tensed. Her solutions were always poison. "You need proper household management," she purred. "Someone to handle the domestic affairs my sister once managed so beautifully." She saw her chance for revenge, for punishing him for taking Sarah away from Boston society. This was her moment. "I've arranged for help," she said, the trap springing shut. "She arrives today. You will accept her services, or I will call in Sarah's share of this land. And I will take everything." Before he could even process the threat, another wagon appeared on the road, a simple transport from the train station. Margaret's eyes gleamed. The wagon stopped. A woman stepped down. She was maybe 40, her posture straight, her eyes sharp and intelligent. But in this corner of Wyoming, the first thing anyone saw was the color of her skin. She was a black woman, dignified and calm, standing in the heart of a storm she didn't yet understand. "Thaddeus," Margaret said, savoring every word, "meet your new household manager, Harriet May Washington, from Boston." The trap was perfect. Margaret expected him to explode, to refuse, to send the woman packing in a rage of prejudice. The whole town would be on his back in an hour. Then Margaret could claim he broke their deal, and the courts would hand her the ranch. It was checkmate. Harriet stood perfectly still, her bag at her feet. She'd seen this game before. She read the whole ugly scene in a single sweeping glance. Thaddeus saw the smug victory in Margaret's eyes. He felt the weight of the town's judgment before it even began. Sheriff Kane would be out here by sundown. The school teacher, Abigail Monroe, would have a field day with the gossip. But then he looked at Harriet, and he saw something he hadn't seen in 12 years. He saw Sarah. Not in her face, but in her bearing. That same quiet strength, that same unshakable dignity. This was no pawn in Margaret's game. He made a decision. "The terms?" he asked, his voice rough. Margaret's smile faltered. This wasn't part of the plan. Harriet spoke for the first time, her voice clear and cultured, with no trace of fear. "Standard domestic arrangement. Cooking, cleaning, management of the household accounts. Room and board, plus wages. I managed the affairs of the Peaton family in Boston for 8 years. I can provide references." The Peatons, old money, powerful money. Margaret's perfect trap was starting to rust. Thaddeus didn't hesitate. He walked over and picked up Harriet's bag. "Fine, we'll try it." Margaret's face turned scarlet with fury. Her masterpiece of revenge was ruined. She scrambled back into her carriage, her movements sharp and angry. "The whole territory will hear of this," she shrieked as the carriage spun around. "Don't expect a warm welcome." The carriage vanished, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence. Thaddeus and Harriet were alone. The weight of his choice settled on him like a shroud. "The lady seems displeased," Harriet observed calmly. "She was betting you'd be gone by sunset," Thaddeus grunted, heading for the house. "Run off by me or the whole town." Harriet followed, her professional gaze taking in every detail. The barn was solid but sagging. The fences were down. Sarah's flower boxes were rotted and empty. The ranch wasn't dying. It was already dead. But the inside of the house was where the real horror lay. Dishes were piled high, a monument to despair, and on the kitchen table a chaotic mess of papers. Official papers. papers with seals and stamps that made Harriet's eyes narrow, unpaid bills, unanswered letters, and territorial tax notices stamped in red. Urgent. Final notice. When was the last time you reviewed your accounts? She asked, her voice neutral. Thaddeus's jaw went tight. I manage fine. But she saw it, a flash of pure panic in his eyes as her hand hovered over a letter from the bank. She'd seen that look on the faces of proud Boston merchants, men hiding secrets that could ruin them. She started to clean, to bring order to the chaos. And with every paper she picked up, the story got worse. Outstanding debts, missed deadlines for land filings, legal warnings from neighbors about straying cattle. This wasn't mismanagement. This was a complete collapse. Thaddeus had fled to the woodpile, the sound of his axe splitting the air with a desperate, violent rhythm. Every swing was a cry of fear and frustration. He was trapped. Keep Harriet and face the town's wrath. Send her away and lose the ranch. But as Harriet sorted the papers, she realized the truth was far worse than that. Thaddeus wasn't just losing his ranch. He was losing it because he couldn't read a single word on the papers that were about to destroy him. 3 weeks crawled by. The silence in the house was a living thing. Harriet worked miracles. The kitchen gleamed. Hot meals appeared like clockwork. The house began to feel like a home again. But the pile of official papers on the desk remained a venomous snake, coiled and waiting. Thaddeus avoided that desk like it was cursed. Harriet watched him, her heart aching. Tax notices, legal letters, each one a ticking bomb. And he was completely blind to the danger. His anxiety was a constant hum in the air, growing louder with every passing day. Then on a Tuesday morning, the fuse was lit. Sheriff Eldridge Kane rode up, his badge shining in the sun. He was a man who enjoyed his authority, and he didn't approve of what he saw at the Riley Ranch. "Mornin', Riley," he said, not quite meeting Thaddeus's eyes. "Got some rustler activity on the eastern boundaries. Territorial office wants all ranchers to file protective claims by the end of the week." He handed Thaddeus a folded document, thick with legal language. Thaddeus took it like he was taking a hot coal. His hand trembled. "Just need you to read through the boundary descriptions and put your signature on it," Kane said, his eyes narrowing at the rancher's strange hesitation. Simple enough. The blood drained from Thaddeus's face. He just stood there, clutching the paper, his knuckles white. Kane's gaze flickered to Harriet, standing silently in the doorway. His expression soured. "Heard you got some unusual help out here." "She earns her keep," Thaddeus said, his voice tight. "I'm sure she does," Kane sneered. "Just remember, folks in this territory have certain expectations about how things ought to be." The threat hung in the air long after the sheriff rode away. Thaddeus collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table, staring at the unopened document as if it held his death warrant. His breathing was shallow. Sweat beaded on his brow. Harriet knew this was the moment. The secret had to come out. She approached him slowly, gently. "The letters are only marks on paper, Thaddeus. They have no power over you." His head snapped up, his eyes burning with a terrible, cornered shame. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The same way you don't know what those tax notices say," she pressed, her voice soft but firm. "Or the letters from the bank. Or any of the papers that have been piling up since your wife died." He shot to his feet, knocking the chair over. "I managed just fine before you got here." "You are about to lose everything," Harriet said, the words landing like stones. "Everything, because you cannot read." The silence that followed was absolute. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a crushing defeat 12 years in the making. His broad shoulders slumped. "Sarah!" "She handled all that," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I never needed to." He couldn't look at her. The shame was too much. "She knew, but she never made me feel small." Harriet's heart broke for him, a man of such natural intelligence. A man who had built this ranch with his bare hands and keen instincts, brought to his knees by a secret shame. "I could teach you," she said quietly. He looked up, stunned. "What?" "Reading, writing, arithmetic," she said, her conviction growing stronger. "I taught the Peton children back in Boston. Their father used to say I could make the alphabet sing. Why? He choked out. Why would you do that for me? Harriet thought for a moment. Because you picked up my bag when your sister-in-law expected you to spit on me. Because this ranch deserves to live. And because no man should have to live in fear of a piece of paper. That night the lessons began. By the warm glow of the kerosene lamp, Harriet opened a child's primer on the kitchen table. Thaddeus felt like a fool, a giant of a man stumbling over letters a 5-year-old could master. But Harriet was patient. She was kind. She never condescended. Think of them as cattle brands, she explained one night, seeing his frustration. You can read 100 different brands from a mile away. Letters are no different. They're just marks that tell a story. The breakthrough came nearly a month later. He was struggling through a territorial statute, his finger tracing the word slowly. Then the marks suddenly resolved into meaning. Water rights must be filed annually. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a wonder so pure it was breathtaking. It was the look of a man seeing the sun for the first time. I read that, he breathed. I read it. Harriet smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. Knowledge is freedom, Thaddeus. Once you have it, no one can ever take it away. Their evening lessons became a secret world, a sanctuary. He told her how he'd built the ranch, memorizing cattle bloodlines, judging the weather by the feel of the air, learning the land by walking every inch of it. She told him of her own education, a gift from a minister's wife who believed knowledge was a divine right. He wasn't just learning to read words. He was learning to see the world differently. The fear in his eyes was replaced by a quiet confidence. And something else was happening in the soft lamplight. Two lonely souls, isolated by secrets and prejudice, were finding a connection deeper than words on a page. It was a dangerous, unspoken thing. The territory was not ready for it. They were not ready for it. But in the quiet hours of the night, as a proud rancher learned to write his own name, love was taking root in the most unlikely soil. And a storm was gathering just over the horizon. Word got out. Of course it did. This was a small territory with long memories and even longer tongues. The school teacher, Abigail Monroe, made sure of it. She saw herself as the guardian of the town's morality, and what was happening at the Riley Ranch was, in her eyes, an abomination. It's not natural, she'd whisper at the general store, at the church social, to anyone who would listen. A man like him, alone out there with her. It's a stain on our community. The town began to turn. The blacksmith suddenly charged Thaddeus double. The feed store owner was always just about out of what he needed. People who had known him for 20 years would cross the street to avoid him. Harriet took it all in stride. She'd faced down far worse than the gossip of small-minded people. When she went to town, she held her head high, her gaze direct and unflinching. Her dignity was a weapon they didn't know how to fight. Then the rustlers came. They hit 3 ranches in a week, swift and brutal, vanishing into the night with entire herds. Panic spread like a fever. These weren't lone thieves. This was an organized gang. Sheriff Kane called an emergency meeting at the town hall. When Thaddeus walked in, a wall of silence and suspicion met him. The other ranchers huddled together, pointedly turning their backs on him. Kane spread a map on the table. They're smart and they're fast. We need coordinated patrols, but they have to be legal. The last thing we need are federal marshals breathing down our necks for vigilante justice. The room filled with frustrated muttering. Legal meant paperwork. It meant statutes and regulations none of them understood. What about crossing property lines? Someone shouted. If we're in hot pursuit, can we follow them onto a neighbor's land? How do we prove which cattle are which if we get them back? Another asked. Kane shuffled his papers, clearly out of his depth. The legal language was a foreign tongue to these men of the land. Thaddeus stood in the back listening, and as he listened, Harriet's voice was in his head. Night after night, they had gone over these exact territorial codes: property rights, citizen defense, documentation requirements. What had been meaningless squiggles on a page was now a clear map in his mind. He felt a new kind of power stir within him. Slowly, he stepped forward. Every eye in the room turned to him, filled with scorn and suspicion. Section 43 of the Territorial Statute, Thaddeus said. his voice clear and steady, ringing through the tense hall. It allows for cross-boundary pursuit, but only in fresh pursuit, defined as within 24 hours of a documented theft. The silence was deafening. These men had known Thaddeus Riley his whole life. They had never heard him speak like this. It was as if another man had taken over his body. Documentation, he continued, gaining confidence, means a written inventory of all stolen livestock, including brand markings, filed with the territorial office within 48 hours. Without that paperwork, any cattle you recover are just disputed property. They'll be tied up in court for years. Sheriff Kane stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. Riley? Where in the hell did you learn all that? A man's got to stay on top of his business, Thaddeus said simply. He didn't look at the other ranchers. He looked at the map. For the next hour, he laid it all out. A plan, a legal, effective, coordinated defense strategy, patrol schedules that wouldn't break the law, a system for documenting losses that would stand up in any court, a communication network using signal fires that was both fast and legally defensible. He wasn't just quoting laws. He was leading them. The scorn in the room slowly turned to grudging respect, then to outright awe. This was the knowledge they needed to survive, and it was coming from the man they had all decided to cast out. When the meeting was over, they crowded around him, asking for copies of his documentation procedures, asking for his help in organizing patrols. Jonas Fletcher, a rancher who hadn't given him the time of day an hour earlier, lingered behind. Heard you got some good help out at your place, Riley, he said, his eyes shrewd. Someone who understands these business matters. I've got competent management, Thaddeus replied, his gaze unwavering. No shame in that. Fletcher nodded. No shame at all. The message was crystal clear. Survival was more important than prejudice. Thaddeus returned to the ranch that evening, exhausted but feeling a foot taller. Harriet had a hot meal waiting. The news had already reached her. The whole territory is buzzing, she said, a quiet pride in her voice. They're calling you a leader. He looked at her across the lamp-lit kitchen table. The woman who had given him back his voice, his pride, his future, couldn't have done it without a good teacher. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the space between them crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with reading lessons and everything to do with the unspoken truth of their hearts. But their victory had been noticed, and the forces aligning against them were just beginning to gather their strength. Just as the territory began to see Thaddeus as a leader, Margaret Whitmore returned. She rolled into town like a black thunderhead, expecting to find her brother-in-law broken and his ranch in ruins. Instead, she found a miracle. The house had a fresh coat of paint. The fences were mended. The cattle were healthy and grazing in well-organized pastures. The ranch wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Then Thaddeus walked out of the house holding a ledger book. The sight of him struck her dumb. The beaten man she'd left for dead was gone. This man stood tall, his eyes clear and confident. He looked powerful. You seem surprised, Margaret, he said, a cold smile playing on his lips. Where did you get the money for all this? She sputtered. Proper management turns a profit, he said. Who knew? Inside, her fury grew. The house was immaculate. On the desk, paperwork was stacked in neat, organized piles. Financial records, legal filings, all bearing the official stamp of the territorial office. And then she saw Harriet moving through the house, not like a servant, but like a mistress of her domain. There were fresh curtains on the windows, a bowl of wildflowers on the table. These weren't the touches of an employee. They were the touches of a woman building a home. I want to see the books, Margaret demanded. Thaddeus spread them on the table. The numbers were undeniable. Income had doubled. Expenses were down. The ranch was more profitable than it had been even when Sarah was alive. Her legal threats were meaningless now. Her eyes narrowed, shifting from the ledger to Harriet. Impressive, she hissed. Though one wonders where such sudden business acumen comes from. Perhaps your help provides services beyond cooking and cleaning. The insult was a snake, striking in the quiet kitchen. Thaddeus's hands clenched into fists. Be careful, Margaret. You're a guest in my house. She had lost the financial battle, so she started a new war. A war of scandal. Within days, the whispers she started with her ally, Abigail Monroe, became a torrent of filth. "It's unnatural," Abigail would say to the ladies at the church auxiliary. "That woman has him under some kind of spell, filling his head with ideas no decent man should entertain." The implication was clear. It wasn't about business. It was about race and sex, the two most potent poisons in their arsenal. A good white man, corrupted by a clever black woman. Sheriff Kane came calling again, his face a mask of grim duty. "Got formal complaints, Riley, about improprieties. Folks are saying there are unseemly arrangements out at your place." "What folks?" Thaddeus demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "That ain't the point. The point is community standards." The words stung. He finally understood. Harriet's real crime wasn't that she was a black woman living in his house. Her crime was that she was intelligent. Her sin wasn't corrupting him, it was elevating him. Kane's investigation found nothing. Separate bedrooms, a professional, respectful relationship. But the poison had been spread. The doubt was planted. The economic attack started again, but this time with more force. The bank began to question his deposits. The feed store in the next town over suddenly had a broken wagon wheel and couldn't make deliveries. They were trying to strangle the ranch, to starve them out. "They can't beat us with the law, so they'll try to beat us with hunger," Harriet observed one night, reviewing the dwindling supplies. But the worst attacks were personal. Abigail Monroe's whispers grew louder, more specific. She was filling his head with dangerous ideas about equality. She was teaching him to defy the natural order of things. One evening, searching for a legal document, Thaddeus found a small locked box in the bottom of Sarah's old writing desk. He broke the lock. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. They were in Sarah's hand. They were love letters. To him. Letters she had written, but never had the heart to give him, filled with her dreams for their future, for the children they would have. As he read, Harriet watched the grief on his face soften, replaced by a kind of quiet peace. "She writes about our children," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "about how she would teach them to read and write, so they would have all the advantages we never did." He looked up at Harriet, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "She would have liked you, Harriet. She always said a sharp mind was the most beautiful thing in the world." That night, something shifted between them. The last wall crumbled. This was no longer about a ranch. It was no longer about lessons. It was about two hearts that had found a home in each other. The next morning, a boy from the telegraph office rode up, his horse kicking up dust. He handed Harriet a yellow envelope. She opened it. Her hands began to shake. Her face was a storm of emotions: fear, disbelief, shock, and a joy so fierce it looked like pain. "What is it?" Thaddeus asked, rushing to her side. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, and whispered a name he had never heard. My daughter found me." The telegram trembled in her hand. Grace Washington Fletcher, a daughter sold away from her 23 years ago. A ghost from a past Harriet never spoke of. She was alive, and she was coming to Wyoming. "She's married," Harriet whispered in awe, reading the words again and again. "To a businessman in Denver. She learned to read. She found me through old church records." A lifetime of buried grief and hopeless love erupted in that single moment. "When does she arrive?" Thaddeus asked, his mind reeling. "Tomorrow," Harriet breathed. "She arrives on tomorrow's train." The news hit the town like a lightning strike. A mysterious stranger, a black woman from the city, was coming to the Riley Ranch. It was all the fuel Margaret and Abigail needed. "This is it," Margaret declared in her hotel room, pacing like a caged animal. "A strange woman, arriving under a cloud of suspicion. She could be a criminal, a con artist. We can use this to ruin them completely." They immediately began to weave a new web of lies. That Harriet's daughter was fleeing the law, that she was coming to help her mother complete her corruption of Thaddeus Riley. That decent people needed to lock their doors. At the ranch, Harriet was a whirlwind of nervous energy. She scrubbed the spare room until the floorboards shone. This was a dream she hadn't dared to dream for 2 decades. What if Grace hated her? What if her daughter, now a stranger, couldn't forgive her for being sold away? "She might not even remember my face," she confessed to Thaddeus. A child never forgets her mother, he said, but they both knew the world was not that kind. The noon train whistle was a shriek that cut right through Harriet's soul. She stood on the platform in her best dress, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Thaddeus stood beside her, a silent, solid presence against the curious and hostile stares of the town. The train hissed to a stop. A woman stepped down, and time stood still. She was not what anyone expected. She was tall, elegant, dressed in fine but practical clothes that spoke of wealth and good taste. She had Harriet's intelligent eyes, but her bearing was that of a woman used to commanding respect. This was Grace, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, a man stepped down. He was as distinguished as she was elegant, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. He moved with an easy confidence that marked him as a man of power and importance. When the reunion finally happened, it was with a quiet, heartbreaking tenderness. "I remembered your songs," Grace said softly to Harriet, her voice thick with emotion. "The lullabies. I used to hum them to my own children." Harriet finally broke. 23 years of tears poured out in a single cleansing flood as she held the daughter she thought she had lost forever. Thaddeus shook the man's hand. "James Fletcher," the man said, his grip firm. "My wife has been searching for her mother for a very long time." He wasn't just a husband. He was a partner, a protector. Margaret and Abigail watched from the hotel window, their faces twisted in disbelief. This was not the destitute fugitive they had imagined. This was a power couple, radiating success. "We need a new angle," Margaret hissed. "This isn't about crime. It's about foreign influence, corrupting our simple way of life." That night, the ranch house was filled with a light and warmth it hadn't known in years. Grace told her story of being sold, of finding kindness in a teacher who taught her to read, of meeting James, a brilliant businessman who saw her mind and not her past, and of building a life and a family. "I run the books for all of James's companies," Grace said. "Numbers just make sense to me." Then James Fletcher dropped a bombshell of his own. "I'm not just here for a family reunion," he announced over dinner. "I'm looking for investment opportunities. This territory is growing. It needs a modern bank. It needs reliable freight lines. It needs capital." The implications were staggering. This man didn't just have money. He had the kind of money that builds towns, the kind of money that could turn this dusty valley into a hub of commerce. Sheriff Kane, sent by Margaret to investigate the suspicious newcomers, arrived the next morning. He left an hour later, humbled and flustered. James had produced business licenses signed by the territorial governor and letters of credit from the largest bank in Denver. He was not just legitimate, he was a VIP. By the end of the week, James had met with every major rancher in the valley. The men who had shunned Thaddeus were now lining up to shake James Fletcher's hand, desperate for a piece of the prosperity he was offering. Margaret's social war had been crushed under the weight of economic opportunity. The final, killing blow came from Grace. At a town meeting organized to welcome her, she made an announcement. "My husband and I are prepared to fund the construction of a new school for this community," she declared, her voice ringing with passion. "A proper school, one that will be open to every child in this valley, regardless of their background." The crowd erupted. Even the most prejudiced rancher couldn't argue against a better future for his children. Margaret Whitmore watched her influence evaporate. She had tried to destroy Thaddeus and Harriet with foreclosure, with scandal, and with lies. And in return, they had brought prosperity, progress, and hope to the entire territory. She was cornered. She was humiliated. And she had one last card to play. It was a card of pure venom, designed not just to wound, but to kill. She picked up a pen and began to write a letter to the United States Marshal Service. Spring came, and with it, a sense of rebirth. The valley was buzzing. James Fletcher's investments were already creating jobs. Grace's plans for the new school were approved. The ranch was more successful than ever. But the most important change was in Thaddeus's heart. He found Harriet in the kitchen one morning, the early light catching the silver in her hair. He had fought for his land, for his pride, and for his future. Now he would fight for his love. "Marry me, Harriet," he said. The words were simple, direct, and forged in the fire of everything they had survived. She turned, her eyes searching his. For a long moment, she was silent. This territory, the world, is not ready for a marriage like ours. Then we'll make it ready, he said. Just then, the sound of galloping hooves shattered the morning calm. Sheriff Kane slid his horse to a stop, his face pale and grim. "It's Margaret Whitmore," he said without preamble. "She's done it. She's filed a formal complaint with the territorial government, with the federal marshals. Margaret's final, desperate attack had been launched. She's petitioning to have you both arrested," Kane said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "on charges of moral corruption and violating territorial morality statutes. She's claiming you are a threat to the community." The accusations were legal poison, designed to destroy their reputations even if they couldn't be proven. "There's more," Kane said, looking down at his saddle horn. "She's got Abigail Monroe and a dozen others to sign sworn affidavits. They're claiming Grace's school is part of a conspiracy to corrupt the children with dangerous ideas. It was a declaration of total war. Margaret couldn't win with money or gossip, so she was using the law as a weapon to burn everything to the ground." That evening, the four of them, Thaddeus, Harriet, Grace, and James, sat at the kitchen table. The legal documents were spread before them. The charges were ludicrous, but they were official. They carried the weight of the government. "She can't win," James said, his voice cold with a businessman's fury. "But she can drag you through months of hell, public hearings, humiliation. She can ruin your names forever." "We don't run," Thaddeus said, his hand finding Harriet's on the table. "We fight." The next morning, as they planned their defense, a wagon rolled up to the ranch. Then another, and another. It was Jonas Fletcher, and behind him were nearly every rancher in the valley. They weren't carrying pitchforks. They were carrying papers. "Heard about Margaret's lies," Jonas said, stepping onto the porch. "So we brought some truth." He handed Thaddeus a thick stack of documents. They were counter petitions, sworn statements from every man there, testifying to Thaddeus's character, to his leadership during the Rustler crisis. There were letters from merchants detailing how James Fletcher's investments had saved their businesses. There were statements from parents, passionately supporting Grace's school. "Margaret Whitmore does not speak for us," an old rancher said, his voice rough with emotion. "We know who our friends are." The community meeting was held in the town hall, and it felt more like a trial. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. Margaret stood before them, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage, reading her list of accusations. She spoke of unnatural arrangements, of corrupting influences, of a threat to their very way of life. When she finished, a heavy silence fell. Then Jonas Fletcher stood up. "I want to talk about threats," he said, his voice booming through the hall. "Last year, a threat called rustlers nearly wiped me out. And the man who saved my ranch, who saved all our ranches, was Thaddeus Riley." One by one they stood, a merchant, a blacksmith, a mother of 5. They spoke not of prejudice and fear, but of integrity, of fair business, of the promise of education for their children. They spoke of the community Thaddeus and his family were helping to build. Abigail Monroe sat shrinking in her chair as her friends and neighbors dismantled every lie she had helped to spread. The final word belonged to Grace. She stood, the picture of dignity and strength. "My mother was stolen from her family once," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "You will not allow a woman consumed by hate to steal her family from her again. This community is stronger than her poison. This community is better than her fear." The vote to dismiss Margaret's petition wasn't just a vote. It was a roar. It was the valley finding its soul. Margaret Whitmore left on the evening train, a broken and defeated woman, swallowed by the darkness she had tried to create. 2 weeks later, Thaddeus and Harriet were married on the porch of the ranch house. The whole valley was there. Sheriff Kane, a changed man, officiated the ceremony. Grace's children threw wildflower petals at their feet. A year later, the ranch was the beating heart of a new kind of territory. Harriet's schoolhouse, the first integrated school in the region, was filled with the laughter of children learning together. Grace and James's bank had brought stable prosperity to everyone. One crisp autumn evening, Thaddeus sat on his porch, a small girl, his granddaughter curled in his lap. He was reading a story to her from a book, the words flowing easily, each one a monument to a love that had taught him to see. Inside, he could hear the voices of his wife and his daughter, planning the territory's first public library. They had faced down the worst of hatred and fear, and had answered it not with anger, but by building something beautiful and new. They had proven that love, armed with courage and knowledge, was the most powerful force on earth. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, and let us know in the comments what you think is the strongest force for change in the world.